The gaming industry is on fire. Thousands of jobs are being cut, $200 million projects are being scrapped. Behind closed doors, CEOs are panicking. But in a small office in Bellevue, 360 people are making more money than the entire workforce of Electronic Arts combined. They aren't just winning, they're changing the way we think modern companies are supposed to work. And if they're right, the entire gaming industry isn't just struggling, it's operating on a lie. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Machine. In the first half of 2024, 11,000 jobs disappeared across the top 10 public gaming companies. Microsoft shut down Arcane Austin. Tango Gameworks was gone almost overnight. Embracer Group closed entire divisions around the world. Their restructuring dropped over 4,000 staff and shut 44 studios. Sony wasn't spared either. Internal restructuring hit its PlayStation ecosystem, with studios quietly shuttered or absorbed. Across the entire industry, the pattern was identical. It seemed like no one seemed immune, except for one private company in Washington state. Valve's headcount stayed locked between 330 and 360 people. There were no layoffs or hiring sprees, and there was no quarterly drama. The numbers back up Valve's status. Steam alone generated over $16 billion in revenue in 2025. The total business was projected to clear $17 billion. Divide that by their tiny workforce, and its per-employee figure is approaching $50 million. Microsoft, with its operating system, Cloud Empire, and Xbox combined, generates roughly $1.24 million per employee. Valve runs 40 times higher. Court documents from a 2021 antitrust suit revealed something even uglier for the rest of the industry. The average Valve worker took home almost $1.3 million annually. That figure dates back years. That number today is almost certainly larger, but this isn't just a story about compensation, and it isn't about luck either. Because when you look closely, the difference isn't performance, it's structure. Public gaming companies tied to investor expectations inflated their headcounts during the pandemic boom. They hired aggressively and then cut just as fast when the market turned. When things went south, they didn't just adjust, they bled people out in waves. Valve didn't follow that cycle. Their staffing level behaves like a hard ceiling, not a growth target. It's a structure that stays within its own limits. What does that say about the rest of the industry? The $200 billion gaming sector has been preaching scale for decades, bigger studios, teams, and budget. But this playbook may be the disease, not the cure. The early evidence comes from the only company refusing to play along. Chapter 2. The $0 Marketing Miracle. In modern AAA gaming, budgets don't just get big anymore, they get extreme. Sony's Concord became one of the clearest examples of that. Reports place the development deal at over $200 million. Some estimates push that total closer to $400 million, and that doesn't even include marketing, studio acquisition costs, or the launch push. 8 years of development went into it. The studio behind it, Firewalk, was bought outright by Sony in April 2023. They bet big on Concord as their next big live service hit. The day Concord launched on Steam, 697 players showed up. The title sold almost 25,000 copies, and Sony pulled it off the shelves 14 days later and issued refunds to everyone who paid. Sony shut down Firewalk entirely 2 months after that. Years of work, hundreds of millions in capital, all wiped out in a matter of months. Around the same time, Valve added a project called Deadlock to Steam. It was invite only. There was no reveal trailer, no press tour or IGN exclusive. There was no marketing budget, period. Reviewers who tried to write about it were asked not to. Word spread through Discord servers. On September 2, 2024, Deadlock peaked at just over 171,000 concurrent players. Concord cost Sony roughly $287,000 per peak concurrent user. Deadlock cost Valve basically nothing. The pattern extends beyond those two titles. Helldivers 2 broke out in early 2024, almost entirely through word of mouth. It sold over 12 million copies in just 3 months. Most of the marketing was organic memes about a fictional planet called Malevelon Creek. Manor Lords, built largely by a single Polish developer, moved over 2 million copies in its first 3 weeks. The game had almost no advertising spend, just pure community momentum. So does massive marketing spend actually push away the players that these games want? When Sony spent the GDP of a small island nation broadcasting Concord, what their target audience really heard was different. They heard, "This is corporate and it's trying very hard." Real interest doesn't grow out of billboards, it grows through excitement and word of mouth. Valve built their entire approach around exactly that idea. Access gets earned, not bought. It clearly works. Smaller studios have already started copying that format. The advertising-fueled launch playbook is dying. Something better has finally been proven to work. Chapter 3. The Output Anomaly. What's most unusual about Valve isn't what they ship, it's how cohesively everything operates. Take Counter-Strike 2. This wasn't just a sequel. It meant a full migration to the Source 2 engine, and a rebuilt lighting system, and a complete overhaul of netcode for the most played competitive shooter on the Earth. And then there's the hardware. The Steam Deck OLED wasn't just a refresh, it was a new revision of custom handheld hardware designed around Steam's ecosystem itself. Even their older work still behaves the same way over time. Half-Life Alyx remains the benchmark for modern VR years after release. Each piece feels separate at first glance, but together they don't behave like isolated projects. They behave like one system that never really stops. And it all runs on roughly 360 people, all while operating the largest digital store on PC and running several of the biggest live service games on the planet. Now compare that to the industry standard. At Microsoft, EA, or Activision, it's not unusual for a single AAA blockbuster to require larger teams than Valve's entire workforce. And even with those resources, those giant games still suffer from massive delays. How? The answer is simple. Valve keeps stacking advantages. Every project builds on something already in place. Counter-Strike 2 didn't need to build an audience. It inherited one, formed over 2 decades. Deadlock didn't need to solve payments or distribution. Steam already handled it. The Steam Deck didn't need to create a software ecosystem from scratch. Proton was already doing the heavy lifting. Nothing starts from zero, and because of that, Valve doesn't scale its team the way other companies do. It stays small by design. There's no boardroom bureaucracy, no focus group revisions or shareholder reviews. Smaller teams pulling in the same direction tend to beat massive ones more often than people think. And the opposite is worth paying attention to. When a company announces it's hiring thousands more developers, it can sound like momentum, but that doesn't always lead to faster shipping. Sometimes it's the opposite. In some cases, it can mean slower results further down the line. Chapter 4. The Shadow Hierarchy. There's a polished version of Valve that gets repeated in tech articles: the flat hierarchy, the rolling desks, the employee handbook that promises you can move to whatever project excites you the most. It's a great story, but it's a half-truth, at least to people who've worked there. Glassdoor reviews and ex-employee accounts describe something the brochure doesn't mention: cabals. Not in the conspiratorial sense, but there's long-tenured groups of senior engineers, designers, and economists. They quietly decide which project gets funded and which gets shelved, which new hires get integrated, and which get iced out. One former employee compared the social dynamic to a high school cafeteria with budget authority. Another described being technically free to work on anything while being unable to get anyone to collaborate on the project they chose. Even without formal titles, there is still power inside the company. Pay can swing wildly based on peer perception. Coworkers evaluate each other, and bonuses or influence are determined by it. If someone can't read the unwritten rules of the room, they usually don't last long. The freedom is real, but so is the pressure surrounding it. For the people who fit in, Valve offers an unusual amount of autonomy and enormous pay. For the people who don't, the exit tends to happen quickly. A public company would never survive this culture. Compliance and HR teams would step in. There would be a raft of class actions. The intensity that makes Valve's team punch above its weight doesn't work inside public company rules. The system works, but not in the clean, idealistic way that the mythology suggests. There's a harder edge underneath it. Pretending otherwise ignores the people who actually had to live inside it. But the model proves something the rest of the industry has gotten lazy about. Hiring small teams of really good people who fit the culture beats hiring big just to hire big. Nobody is saying go copy the cabals. The real lesson is easier. Lowering your hiring bar to grow fast quietly damages the company. A company that stays small on purpose hires carefully. It protects what makes it work. That company may be doing more for its people than one that tripled its team to look good on LinkedIn, especially when half of them got laid off 2 years later. The setup favors the smaller, harder operation. Workers actually get paid more and output increases. Whether that works as a business is no longer up for debate. Chapter 5. The Passive Empire. But the real scale of Valve doesn't come from selling games. Steam takes a cut of every game sold on the platform, historically around 30%, scaling down for higher volume publishers. That alone is massive business, but it's only the surface layer. There are also marketplaces for in-game items, especially in Counter-Strike 2 and Dota 2. Players trade weapon skins, charms, and cosmetics in volumes that start to resemble financial markets more than game economies. And Valve takes 15% of every transaction. The Counter-Strike case and skin economy alone made over $1 billion in 2023. The income arrives whether or not Valve releases new content. During peak periods, the marketplace alone is estimated to generate serious revenue, at times more than the entire annual earnings of mid-sized publishers. And none of it comes from releasing a new game. The strategic payoff is huge. Most game companies are stuck. Every quarter, they have to ship something new just to pay their bills. Valve doesn't. Its systems create something like a permanent cash floor, and that lets it experiment, kill or pause projects, and wait a decade if they want. They have no pressure to ship sequels. They can afford to wait until something is interesting. Compare that to a publisher burning hundreds of millions every quarter. Their boards demand progress across multiple live service projects at once. The difference isn't just scale, it is breathing room. So why hasn't Valve gone full Microsoft and bought every studio in sight? The restraint itself is part of the strategy. Acquisitions force you to merge cultures and expand headcount. They open up new legal risks and management problems that Valve has spent 30 years working to avoid. Public companies pushed by dividend demands or shareholders almost always deploy excess cash on something. Valve just lets the money pile up and sink it into something that appeals. Real independence means owning your own distribution, not renting it from someone else. So what does that mean for stuck studios in stores they don't own? The answer is not great. But the framing makes things much clearer for anyone trying to figure out where the real advantages actually are. Chapter 6. The 10-Year Gamble. Most people remember the Steam Deck launching in 2022 and being a hit. What gets lost is everything that came before it. The full version of SteamOS eventually launched alongside the original commercial Steam machines in late 2015. The standalone controllers only sold 500,000 units by mid-2016, and the actual console sold far worse than that. The whole project looked like a flop. A normal company would have killed it. Google launched Stadia in 2019 and buried it just 3.5 years later. Amazon's Crucible barely lasted 6 months. Valve didn't kill SteamOS, they kept it alive. They built Proton, software that lets Windows games run on Linux without the developer doing anything. They made parts of it open to everyone. They kept improving Linux in the background by contributing directly to it. Most importantly, they didn't rush it. For almost a decade, it looked like an expensive side project. Then, on February 25, 2022, the Steam Deck shipped. It didn't just sell, it created a whole new category. Suddenly, the decade of Linux work was the foundation of a hardware ecosystem, one that was chipping away at Microsoft's grip on PC gaming. The assumption that Windows is the only place serious games can survive started to crumble. Every one of those purchases pulled PC gaming further away from Microsoft's old revenue model. It worked so well that competitors began scrambling, trying to catch up to a future that Valve started building years earlier. Asus, Lenovo, MSI, and others have since developed their own Windows-based handhelds. You can't do this as a public company. Shareholders wouldn't want to entertain the idea of spending 10 years building an operating system. They would want to see numbers in the profit column. Valve doesn't have that problem. Gabe Newell reportedly owns over 50% of the company. That alone changes everything. There's no board pushing for a different direction. There's no pressure to show short-term wins at the expense of long-term work. Decisions don't have to look good in the next financial report. They just have to still make sense years down the line. Patient money, when it's actually used patiently, beats short-term money by a mile. It's not even a fair fight. Founder-controlled companies, dual-class shares, and staying private may be the only ways to make the long game work. People are now starting to take notice because most of those structures are emerging across tech now. The playbook is now clear enough to copy. Chapter 7. The Last Gatekeeper. Valve markets Steam as an open platform. Anyone with a developer account and $100 can publish a game. The store famously refuses to curate. Instead, the market should decide what succeeds. That stance has won them goodwill from indie developers for a generation. But it's not the whole story. Steam's recommendation algorithm quietly buries thousands of low-effort releases every year. The recommendation engine decides which games get shown to which users. Asset-flipped titles get buried. The AI-generated slop games that have flooded every major storefront also get buried. Valve now requires disclosure for AI-generated content, and any game that breaks the basic quality rules gets banned outright. So the idea that Steam is non-curated doesn't really hold up. It is curated, just not in the obvious way. That puts Valve in a tricky spot. They get a huge boost from being seen as the indie developer's friend, the platform that lets the market speak. But they also have to protect that platform, otherwise the store drowns in 50,000 annual releases of drag-and-drop junk. The two goals aren't fully compatible, so Valve does what public companies can't pull off. They make a quiet, practical compromise. They take the small hit of looking a bit hypocritical, and then they just move on. Are they protecting the ecosystem, or are they the gatekeeper who decides which developers get to eat? Both, probably. The platform scale is what made the slop flood possible in the first place. Over 20,000 games hit Steam in 2025 alone. Valve also built systems that actively shape how that ranking works. It's not random, it's structured. The whole setup is messy, but it keeps Steam's discovery feeling intact. Games still feel like they can break through on their own, even as the store quietly filters, sorts, and surfaces what rises to the top. While newer storefronts struggle under the same explosion of content, Steam doesn't. It adapts. This type of moderation might be the only way platforms this size last without turning into heavy-handed publishers or becoming chaotic dumping grounds. Valve has shown a third, messier path. Sure, it doesn't quite match their own marketing, but it works. Chapter 8. The Pivot. None of this really makes sense in isolation. Valve ships more than its peers with a fraction of the staff. It does it without marketing, runs a culture that wouldn't survive public ownership, but still produces results that work. It's not a structure that's replicated in the big-name studios. Any of those looks impossible by itself, but that combination is something else entirely. It works because Valve has refused from day one to play the same game everyone else is playing. Just one founder, a handful of senior partners, and the freedom to ignore everyone's opinion on what a modern tech company should look like. Most coverage of Valve treats this as something quirky, but there's a clearer pattern underneath. A lot of what feels normal in big companies only exists because of outside money. Quarterly reporting, acquisitions, large staff numbers, heavy marketing expenditure. None of it is strictly required to make or distribute software. A small group of people building what they actually want to build with enough money to take their time. That's what makes it feel unusual. Why? Because everyone else has been so used to the status quo that they forgot that this one was even an option. Chapter 9. The Sovereign State. Valve isn't really a company in the standard sense. It behaves more like a small private state. Headquartered in Bellevue, it runs with its own internal rules that cover hiring, pay packages, and long-term strategies. There is nothing outside of the company that forces it to behave to the industry norm. And that's the key difference. Valve doesn't behave like a company trying to win inside of a market. It behaves like something that stepped out of the usual system entirely. And once you see it that way, the decisions that look unusual from the outside start to make more sense. Replicating Valve completely is almost impossible. Very few founders still own a majority of a profitable software giant. Very few cultures have been tuned this carefully over 20 years. Their advantage is specific. Owning the biggest PC game store on Earth is something only one company can do. But the rest? Companies can learn from it. Smaller studios watched the public market wreckage and they decided they wanted no part of it. Look at Local Thunk, the solo developer behind Balatro. He turned down buyout offers and deliberately kept the operation small. Or Sven Vinke at Larian Studios, the team behind Baldur's Gate 3. He's run the studio for decades without taking it public. They recently shipped a generational hit on their own terms after walking away from publisher deals. None of these companies will become Valve. They don't need to. Each has picked up enough of the playbook to punch above their financial weight. Their combined success quietly proves the bigger is better idea is wrong. Gaming isn't finished. The industry layoffs aren't even over yet. The next wave is probably already in motion. AAA budgets are still blowing up past anything sustainable, and marketing departments are still pouring money into campaigns nobody asked for. The bleeding will go on. Some of the studios closing right now were doing really good work. The people losing their jobs deserved better than what their employers' money problems pushed on them. But somewhere in Bellevue, 360 people are proving a point, year after year. It's not just tech giants under the microscope, game development is feeling it too. Watch why GTA 6 is taking forever to make, to see why Rockstar is under so much pressure to deliver. Or click on this video instead.